To understand how Spanish silver from the Americas transformed the entire European economy, we have to go back to a crisis that sounds almost backward when you think about it today. Europe had a money shortage. Not a shortage of wealth or resources, but an actual shortage of precious metals. And in the 16th century, precious metals were money. For centuries, Europe had been starved for gold and silver. The mines of Central Europe in Bohemia, in Germany, in Hungary produced what they could, but it was never enough. Merchants who wanted to expand their trade found themselves constantly handicapped. They didn't have enough coins. They didn't have enough bullion. Commerce was difficult to facilitate without adequate precious metals. Some scholars have estimated that by the 1550s, European silver production was actually declining. The continent's traditional sources were running dry. Europe was facing a genuine monetary crisis, and nobody knew what to do about it. But then, in 1492, a determined sailor named Christopher Columbus set foot in the Caribbean. He was looking for a passage to the Indies. He was searching for Asian spices and riches. What he found instead was something that would change everything. A vast continent, abundant land, and hidden within those mountains and highlands, an amount of precious metal so enormous that it would reshape the entire world economy. It would make some nations unimaginably wealthy. It would also trigger one of history's most persistent and damaging inflations. The world was about to change forever. For the first few decades after Columbus, Spanish conquistadors did what conquistadors do. They plundered, they looted temples, they melted down the accumulated treasures of the Aztecs and Incas. Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro brought back fortunes in stolen artifacts and gold. This was immediate wealth, easy wealth, but it couldn't last forever. The real treasure wasn't lying around waiting to be taken. It was buried in the mountains. In 1545, something extraordinary happened. Spanish explorers found it. They discovered a mountain in the high Andes, in what is now Bolivia, that contained such vast quantities of silver ore that it seemed almost infinite. This mountain became known as Cerro Rico, the Rich Hill. At over 4,000 meters above sea level, in the freezing solitude of the Andes, this single peak would become the engine of a global economic transformation. A city grew up around this mountain. It was called Potosí, and Potosí became one of the largest cities in the world. Not gradually, rapidly. By 1560, only 15 years after the discovery, Potosí had 3,200 miners pulling silver out of the mountain. By 1570, the city was home to 120,000 people. By the 1590s, it had grown to 160,000 residents, making it bigger than London, bigger than Rome. It was the second largest city in all the Americas, rivaled only by Mexico City. And it existed for one reason alone: silver. The scale of production was utterly without precedent. By 1560, with those 3,200 miners working the mountain, Potosí was shipping 5 million troy ounces of silver per year to Spain. 5 million ounces! That was more than all the silver that all of Europe combined had ever produced in an entire year. But this was just the beginning. The production numbers were about to get even more staggering. In 1560, prospectors made another crucial discovery. They found enormous deposits of mercury at Huancavelica in Peru, about 700 miles north of Potosí. Now, you might be wondering why mercury was so important. A few years earlier, in Mexico, miners had figured out something revolutionary. They developed a new technique called the patio process. This method could take low-grade ore that was previously worthless because it contained very little silver, and process it into usable metal. The mercury made it possible. Mix the crushed ore with mercury, salt, and copper sulfate. Spread it all out on a cobblestone patio, and you could extract silver from rock that had previously been thrown aside as waste. When the patio process was fully implemented at Potosí in the 1580s, production exploded. We're talking about an exponential increase. One Spanish writer at the time called the combination of Huancavelica mercury and Potosí silver a match made in heaven. He had no idea how right he was. By the 1590s, Potosí had over 600 active mines. 600 mines pulling silver out of a single mountain. At peak production, they were extracting roughly 200,000 kilograms per year. Some estimates suggest the number was even higher. That's 9 million silver pesos annually. Between 1545 and 1650, roughly half of all the silver produced in the entire world came from Potosí alone. To understand what that means, Spanish America was producing 10 times the quantity of silver that all of Europe combined had ever managed to produce. And virtually all of it was flowing directly into European markets through Spanish ports. All of it. The deluge had begun. The first significant amounts of American silver began arriving in Spain during the 1550s. At first, the quantities were manageable, a valuable commodity certainly, but not yet transformative. But as mining techniques improved and the resources of Potosí came into fuller exploitation, the flow became a genuine flood. Ships laden with silver bullion made the Atlantic crossing with increasing frequency. Spanish galleons carried treasure that had to be transported in specialized reinforced vessels to keep the weight from breaking the ships. This treasure did not stay in Spain. It couldn't. The Spanish crown spent it on wars. They spent it on building projects. They used it to pay soldiers across Europe. Spanish monarchs borrowed against future silver shipments. Bankers in Italy held Spanish treasure. Merchants in the Low Countries received payment in American silver. The treasure spread like water finding cracks. Through Seville, through Mediterranean trade routes, through every corner of European commerce. By the last decades of the 16th century, American silver had penetrated everywhere. The Spanish crown itself collected duties on this imported bullion. By the end of the 16th century, roughly 25% of King Philip II's revenue came from American treasure. 25%! Can you imagine? An entire quarter of the crown's income was coming from mines on the other side of the Atlantic. The Spanish used this silver to fight the Ottoman Empire, to wage wars against France, to build El Escorial, one of the greatest building projects of the age, to crush Protestantism across Europe, to finance the Spanish Inquisition. And then something strange began to happen in Spanish markets. Prices started going up. Not gradually, not slightly, but persistently, year after year, decade after decade, the prices of goods in Spanish markets began to rise. This phenomenon would later be called the price revolution, and it was unlike anything Europe had experienced before. The scale of the increase was extraordinary. Over the course of the 16th century, prices in Western Europe rose by approximately 500%. Do you understand what that means? By the end of the century, you needed 5 times as much money to purchase the same goods that cost 1 unit of money in 1500. 5 times as much. Some historians argue that prices rose even higher, up to 6-fold over the entire period. Now, you might think 1 to 1.5% annual inflation sounds modest, but remember, this is the 16th century. There are no central banks. There is no Federal Reserve manipulating interest rates. There is no sophisticated economic policy. Inflation isn't even understood as something you manage. It just happens. And when it does happen, it catches everyone by surprise. Here's where it gets interesting. Prices actually began rising around 1520 to 1525, which is about 25 to 30 years before significant amounts of American silver arrived in European markets. This confused historians for a long time. If American silver was causing the inflation, why did prices start rising before the silver arrived? Some historians argued that population growth, not monetary factors, was driving the prices up. Europe's population was indeed recovering from the medieval plagues. More people meant more demand for food and land. More demand pushes prices up. That's simple economics. But something changed when American silver started flooding into Europe in the 1550s. Something unmistakable. Spanish prices led the way. They rose faster than prices elsewhere, much faster. French merchants complained constantly that Spanish prices had become absurdly high compared to prices in their own country. They lamented that Spanish-American wealth had enriched Spain while simultaneously flooding European markets with so much silver that the metal itself became less valuable. And when silver becomes less valuable, everything priced in silver becomes more expensive. By 1568, a French philosopher named Jean Baudin published a work that articulated what many observers had been sensing. Baudin dismissed earlier theories. He rejected the idea that currency debasement, the practice of reducing precious metal content in coins, was the culprit. Instead, Baudin made a direct, powerful argument. The influx of silver from Spanish America was the primary cause of inflation. He called it something we now recognize as the quantity theory of money. If you dramatically increase the supply of money in circulation without a corresponding increase in the goods available for purchase, the value of money falls and prices rise to compensate. It was simple. It was elegant. And it was true. To understand exactly what was happening, you need to understand how money worked in the 16th century. In the early modern period, money was something radically different from what you're used to today. Money was commodity money. Gold coins and silver coins didn't represent wealth. They were wealth. When you held a silver real or a gold doubloon, you held actual metal. The coin's value was directly tied to the market value of the metal it contained. Gold was gold. Silver was silver. The weight and purity of the metal determined the coin's worth. In this system, the supply of precious metals was effectively the supply of money. When the money supply was limited and relatively static, the value of money stayed stable. Prices didn't fluctuate wildly. A unit of silver in 1400 would buy roughly the same amount of goods as a unit of silver bought in 1450. But when enormous quantities of new metal suddenly flooded into the system, everything changed. The value of each unit of silver fell. It had to. Silver became far more abundant than it had ever been before. Where it had been scarce and precious, it became relatively common. In economic terms, the marginal utility of silver decreased dramatically. Imagine if gold suddenly became as common as copper. What would happen to gold's value? It would plummet. That's what happened to silver. And when the value of silver dropped, so did its purchasing power. Everything priced in silver became more expensive because each unit of silver was now worth less. The Spanish did something interesting with the incoming silver. You might assume they melted it all down immediately and turned it into coins. But recent research examining the metal composition of Spanish coins tells a different story. Isotopic analysis reveals that most Spanish coins minted before the 18th century contained primarily European silver, not American silver. This suggests that Spain didn't immediately convert all the American treasure into coins. Instead, merchants traded it quickly. They moved it through networks. The silver may have circulated as bullion, in international payments, in merchant transactions, but however it moved, the effect was identical. The total money supply increased dramatically. With more silver chasing the same amount of goods, the value of silver fell. And with the value of silver falling, prices began to climb everywhere. What happened next was a cascade of economic and social consequences that rippled through every level of European society. For peasants and agricultural laborers, the poorest members of society, rising prices were a catastrophe. Food prices rose. That's what mattered most to them. A worker who had been able to feed a family on his wages now found that those same wages bought less food. Real wages, wages measured in terms of what they could actually purchase, actually fell. Workers were earning more money, but it bought less. Their standard of living declined. For merchants and traders, the situation created complications. A Spanish merchant who tried to sell goods in France found that his goods were cheaper there than in Spanish markets. Why? Because prices were higher in Spain, this undermined Spain's export competitiveness. Spanish wages rose as prices climbed, making Spanish labor more expensive. Spanish goods became more expensive to produce. Over time, Spanish exports suffered. Foreign buyers could purchase goods more cheaply from non-Spanish sources. The wealth from American silver, paradoxically, was making Spain less competitive, not more. For monarchs and governments, the picture was complicated. On one hand, inflation reduced the real value of debts. If the crown owed a lender a certain amount of silver, that debt remained the same on paper, but it represented less real wealth as prices rose. That provided relief to indebted governments. On the other hand, war became more expensive. War was the great expense of 16th century monarchies. As wages and supply costs rose with inflation, the cost of maintaining armies and navies spiraled upward. The Spanish crown found itself in a vicious circle. It spent American treasure on military campaigns, but inflation caused those campaigns to become more expensive faster than the treasure arrived, so the crown had to borrow even more. By the 1550s, Spain's borrowing costs had become catastrophic. Interest rates rose from roughly 17% to as high as 48%. The Spanish crown borrowed from Italian bankers, German bankers, Flemish merchants. They pledged future treasure shipments as collateral. When those shipments were delayed or smaller than expected, the crown faced default. Between the end of the 16th century and the beginning of the 17th, the Spanish monarchy declared bankruptcy 3 times. 3 times! They ran out of money despite possessing what should have been an endless supply of American silver. The endless supply of treasure, which should have made Spain the richest kingdom in Europe, had somehow left it desperately in debt. American silver did something else that Europeans hadn't anticipated. It didn't stay in Europe. After 1565, Spanish galleons began making a voyage that had never been attempted before. They sailed across the Pacific Ocean from Acapulco in Mexico to Manila in the Philippines. This trans-Pacific route opened up direct trade with Asia. And to buy Asian goods, spices, silk, porcelain, luxury items that commanded enormous prices in Europe, the Spanish needed silver, lots of it. Each Manila galleon carried an average of 3 million silver pieces of 8 per trip. 3 million! Imagine the weight, imagine the value. This silver went straight into Asian markets. Chinese merchants valued silver highly and eagerly accepted Spanish-American treasure in exchange for their goods. In fact, around the time that American silver began flooding the world, China switched from paper money to silver as its primary currency. This meant that Asian demand for silver was increasing at precisely the moment that American production was soaring. Some historians argue this is crucial to understanding why European prices rose as dramatically as they did. If China and other Asian markets were absorbing enormous quantities of American silver, then the actual increase in European money supply may have been smaller than the raw numbers might suggest. The silver was being distributed globally. It wasn't all staying in Europe. It was flowing across the Pacific, feeding Asian markets, supporting international commerce on a scale that had never existed before. But even so, European inflation was unmistakable. Prices tripled. Prices quadrupled. By the end of the 16th century, a unit of silver bought roughly 1/4 of what it had bought in 1500. Now, before we continue with the economic story, we have to stop and acknowledge something crucial. Behind every ounce of silver extracted from Potosí and Mexican mines lay human suffering on a scale that's almost impossible to comprehend. The Spanish employed various systems of forced labor to extract this wealth. In Peru, they reintroduced an Inca labor system called the mita. This was a forced labor draft. Indigenous communities were required to send periodic quotas of workers to the mines. These workers descended into those mountains, into mines at extreme altitude, often in sub-zero temperatures. They went down to extract ore in conditions of genuine horror. The patio process that made production possible required handling mercury. Mercury is acutely toxic. Miners who worked with mercury experienced permanent neurological damage. Many suffered crippling disabilities. The mines themselves were death traps. Collapses happened, floods happened, explosions happened, dust from pulverized ore filled the air and destroyed miners' lungs. The combination of low oxygen at high altitude, dangerous working conditions, disease, malnutrition, and mercury poisoning created what Spanish sources themselves called the mouth of hell. How many people died? Historians debate the numbers. Conservative estimates suggest hundreds of thousands. Some exaggerated claims suggest 8 million. Whatever the true number, and it was staggering, it's certain that the silver mines consumed indigenous lives at a horrifying rate. One Spanish viceroy estimated that the Mita system alone displaced 13,500 indigenous men annually from their communities. These men were torn from their families, their labor extracted under duress, often in conditions they simply could not survive. Alongside indigenous laborers, African slaves were increasingly brought into the mines, particularly in Mexico and the Caribbean. The Atlantic slave trade, in its early phases, was substantially driven by the demand for labor in American silver mines. Thousands upon thousands of enslaved Africans died in those mines, working alongside indigenous peoples and poor Spanish migrants in conditions of unspeakable brutality. All of this suffering produced the silver that went into circulation. All of this human cost produced the metal that inflated prices across Europe. The wealth that enriched European monarchs and merchants was built on mountains of corpses. This brings us to one of history's great paradoxes. Spain possessed more precious metal wealth than any power in history had ever possessed. Potosí alone produced a quarter of the world's silver, and yet, over the very century in which Spain was extracting this wealth, Spain underwent profound economic and imperial decline. How is this possible? How can a nation with endless supplies of money become impoverished? The answer lies in how the Spanish spent their treasure. Rather than investing in productive industries, rather than building manufacturing capacity or developing trade networks, Spain poured its resources into military expansion. An enormous portion of American silver went toward paying soldiers in Spain's many wars. The Spanish fought the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean. They fought the French in Europe. They assembled invasion fleets against England. They maintained armies in the Low Countries and in Italy. Military expenditures consumed the vast majority of Spanish treasure. Spain also made a critical strategic choice. Instead of using American wealth to develop internal productive capacity, Spain became dependent on the flow of American silver. The crown came to expect the treasure. They budgeted based on it. They borrowed against it. When production eventually declined, Spain had nothing else to fall back on. Economists call this the resource curse, the phenomenon where abundant natural resources in one region actually correlate with slower, long-term economic development. Spain looked to America for wealth rather than developing its own internal productive capacity. Meanwhile, what were Spain's competitors doing? England was developing merchant fleets, France was building banking systems, the Dutch were establishing trade networks and financial institutions. These nations were creating the infrastructure of modern capitalism. They were developing the systems that would prove more sustainable than reliance on treasure shipments. When the easy wealth of Spanish silver eventually declined, these competitors had built the foundations upon which to compete for the long term. Spain also suffered acutely from the very inflation that American silver produced. Spanish prices rose faster and higher than prices in other European countries. This made Spanish goods expensive and difficult to export. Spanish craftsmen, merchants, and manufacturers found it increasingly difficult to compete with competitors from nations where inflation had not risen as severely. The very source of Spain's apparent wealth was simultaneously eroding the economic foundations of Spanish prosperity. American silver didn't stay in Spain. It spread throughout Europe through multiple mechanisms. First, Spanish merchants who imported foreign goods had to pay for them. Spanish buyers seeking textiles from the Low Countries, wines from France, luxury goods from Italy, they had to pay in silver. This silver flowed out of Spain to pay for imports. Foreign merchants who sold goods in Spanish markets received payment in Spanish silver or in American treasure. They then took this silver back home. Second, the Spanish crown itself distributed American silver throughout Europe. When Spain paid soldiers in Flanders, it paid them in Spanish silver. When Spain paid its debts to Italian bankers or German financiers, it paid them in American treasure. The crown's military and diplomatic activities meant that silver spread widely across the continent. Third, pirates and privateers played an important role in distribution. Spanish treasure ships crossed the Atlantic constantly, and they were constantly under threat. Privateers backed by rival European powers attacked them. English privateers blessed by Queen Elizabeth raided Spanish ships. Dutch pirates did the same. When these attackers were successful, they captured Spanish treasure and took it to their own countries. This informal redistribution accelerated the spread of American silver throughout European markets. Through all these mechanisms, American silver permeated European commerce. It reached Antwerp, it reached London, it reached Paris and Venice. By the end of the 16th century, there was scarcely a merchant in Europe who hadn't handled Spanish-American silver at some point. By the early 17th century, something remarkable happened. The price increases began to slow. By the mid-17th century, inflation had largely ceased. Prices stabilized. After 150 years of relentless upward pressure, the price revolution simply ended. But why? What stopped it? The answer involves several factors working together. First, silver mining output began to decline. Potosí's mines, so phenomenally productive in the 1580s and 1590s, gradually became less productive. The richest and most accessible ores had been worked out. Extracting the remaining ore required going deeper, spending more effort, dealing with increasingly complex technical challenges. The mountain was being exhausted. By 1700, the mines that had once produced a quarter of the world's silver were producing only a fraction of their former output. Mexican mines eventually surpassed Peruvian production, but even those couldn't maintain the exponential growth of the 16th century. The easy, abundant silver was gone. What remained required more labor, more expense, more difficulty to extract. Second, the velocity of money changed. That's a fancy economic term that means how fast money circulates through the economy. As Europeans grew accustomed to higher prices, they adjusted their economic behaviors. Spanish merchants reduced their imports from foreign sources because their goods were becoming too expensive to sell. Less import demand meant less silver flowing out of Spain to pay for those imports. Less silver circulating meant slower inflation. Third, population growth began to slow. The rapid growth of the 16th century leveled off in the early 17th century as plague returned and living standards for the poorest declined. With slower population growth, demand pressures on food and goods eased. The price revolution didn't end because of any deliberate policy. There was no 16th century version of a central bank raising interest rates or reducing money supply. Rather, the inflation stopped because the underlying conditions changed. The exponential growth of American silver production couldn't continue forever. Mines were worked out. Techniques reached their practical limits. The flow of silver from the New World began its long, steady decline. By the time the price revolution ended, the world had been fundamentally transformed. Spain, despite possessing extraordinary wealth, had experienced decline. Its competitors, England, France, and the Dutch Republic, had used the period of inflation to build the economic institutions and trade networks that would allow them to dominate global commerce for the next several centuries. The influx of American silver had been unevenly distributed across European society. The poorest suffered as their real wages declined. Landowners benefited as they could raise rents. Merchants and traders navigated the complexity with varying success. The emerging merchant class, particularly in England and the Dutch Republic, grew wealthier and more powerful. The traditional aristocracy, whose wealth was tied to land, found their real incomes declining. By the late 17th and 18th centuries, as American silver production continued its decline and other sources of precious metal became available, the intensity of inflation gradually eased. But the economic patterns that had been established, the rise of English and Dutch commercial power, the stagnation of the Spanish economy, the reorientation of global trade networks had become permanent features of the world economy. The influx of American silver had fundamentally restructured who had power and who didn't. It had redistributed wealth and power in ways that would shape world history for centuries to come, and it had all started with a desperate search for a passage to the Indies that found a continent full of silver instead.